the invisible mineral powering India's next industrial leap. Sometimes, the biggest investment opportunities don't begin inside a company. They begin inside a government policy. If someone asked you to name the industries that could shape India's future, you might think of semiconductors, electric vehicles, renewable energy, defense, or artificial intelligence. Those are obvious answers. But hidden beneath every one of those industries lies a group of materials that rarely make headlines. Materials so ordinary that most people never think about them, yet so essential that modern manufacturing would struggle without them. One of those materials is boron. It isn't glamorous. It doesn't dominate television debates. It isn't discussed in coffee shop conversations. And yet, if boron suddenly disappeared from India, the consequences would ripple across factories, farms, hospitals, construction sites, glass plants, ceramic manufacturers, steel mills, and even pharmaceutical companies. This is the story of one such material. And more importantly, the story of a company quietly positioned at the center of it. But before we meet that company, we first need to understand why India itself has suddenly become interested in businesses like these. Because every great business story begins with a change in the world around it. Over the last decade, India has undergone one of the biggest economic transformations in its history. For many years, India was known primarily as a service economy. Software, IT outsourcing, business process management, financial services. These sectors created millions of jobs and transformed India's global image. But they also exposed a weakness. Countries that manufacture products usually build deeper industrial ecosystems. Factories create suppliers. Suppliers create logistics companies. Logistics create infrastructure. Infrastructure attracts more investment. And slowly, an entire economic flywheel begins spinning faster. India wanted that flywheel. That is why initiatives such as Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, the National Logistics Policy, Production-Linked Incentive, PLI, schemes, and large-scale infrastructure spending were introduced. At first glance, these policies seem unrelated. One encourages domestic manufacturing. Another supports infrastructure. Another incentivizes industrial investment. Another promotes exports. But if you zoom out, they all point toward the same destination. India wants to manufacture more. Much more. Not simply assemble products imported from elsewhere, but build complete industrial supply chains inside the country. Think of building a house. People usually admire the paint, the furniture, the lighting, the beautiful architecture. Very few people admire cement, or steel rods, or wiring. Yet without those invisible components, the beautiful house simply cannot exist. Industrial economies work exactly the same way. Everyone notices electric vehicles. Few notice the chemicals used to manufacture them. Everyone notices new airports. Few notice the specialty materials required to construct them. Everyone celebrates semiconductor plants. Few ask which industrial chemicals enable semiconductor manufacturing. The invisible layers of the economy often create the strongest foundations. And that is where specialty chemical companies quietly become indispensable. India's chemical industry is expected to play a much larger role over the coming decades. Several forces are coming together at the same time. Global companies are diversifying supply chains beyond a single geography. Environmental regulations are changing manufacturing patterns across the world. Indian infrastructure spending continues to rise. Steel consumption is increasing. Construction activity is expanding. Agricultural productivity remains a national priority. Healthcare manufacturing is becoming more localized. Each of these trends appears independent, but they share one common requirement: reliable access to industrial chemicals. Among these chemicals, boron occupies a surprisingly important position. Although most people have never heard of it, boron quietly serves dozens of industries simultaneously. Imagine a single ingredient used in baking, medicine, electronics, farming, construction, and metallurgy. That ingredient would become valuable not because one industry depends on it, but because many industries do. That is exactly how boron behaves. In agriculture, it improves crop health by supplying essential micronutrients. In steel manufacturing, it enhances material properties. In glass and ceramics, it improves durability and heat resistance. In pharmaceuticals, extremely high purity boric acid serves specialized medical applications. In construction materials, boron compounds improve performance. Even modern fiberglass and advanced materials depend on boron chemistry. This diversity creates an interesting economic characteristic. Unlike businesses dependent on a single customer or a single sector, demand for boron spreads across multiple industries. When one sector slows down, another often continues growing. This doesn't eliminate business cycles, but it softens them. And investors often appreciate businesses with diversified demand sources. Now consider India's position. India consumes a significant amount of boron-based products, yet the country possesses very limited domestic boron mineral reserves. Much of the raw material still comes from imports. That creates both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is obvious. Imported raw materials expose manufacturers to currency fluctuations, shipping disruptions, geopolitical tensions, and global commodity prices. But the opportunity is equally powerful. If Indian companies can efficiently convert imported raw materials into high-value specialty chemical products domestically, they become an important part of India's manufacturing ecosystem. Instead of exporting value creation elsewhere, they capture it inside India. This is exactly the kind of industrial capability policymakers hope to encourage. Not because boric acid itself is exciting, but because everything built on top of it becomes more competitive. There is another reason why investors increasingly pay attention to specialty chemical businesses. They often possess characteristics very different from commodity businesses. Imagine two restaurants. The first serves generic meals anyone can cook. Customers constantly compare prices. Margins remain low. Competition is intense. The second restaurant serves a highly specialized cuisine requiring years of expertise, trusted quality, strict hygiene standards, and recipes difficult to replicate. Customers still care about price, but they care even more about consistency. The second restaurant enjoys stronger pricing power. Specialty chemicals work similarly. When customers rely on precise chemical specifications, regulatory approvals, and decades of manufacturing expertise, changing suppliers becomes difficult. Trust becomes part of the product, and trust usually takes much longer to build than factories. That distinction separates many specialty chemical companies from ordinary commodity producers. Of course, none of this guarantees success. Government policies can create opportunities, but policies alone never build great companies. Factories must operate efficiently. Management must allocate capital wisely. Products must meet customer expectations. Competition never disappears. Markets constantly evolve. History is full of businesses that operated in attractive industries but failed because execution never matched opportunity. This is where investing becomes fascinating. The industry creates possibilities. Management determines outcomes. So now we understand something important. India is attempting one of the largest manufacturing transformations in its history. Specialty chemicals form one of the invisible foundations supporting that transformation. Boron-based chemicals occupy a unique position because they quietly serve agriculture, infrastructure, pharmaceuticals, steel, construction, glass, and advanced manufacturing all at once. Government policies have created a favorable backdrop. Industrial demand appears structurally stronger than it did a decade ago. But a favorable environment alone doesn't answer the most important question. Which companies are actually positioned to benefit from this shift? Among the many businesses operating in India's chemical industry, one company has spent more than 4 decades quietly building expertise in a niche that most investors rarely discuss. It isn't the largest chemical company in India. It isn't the most famous. Yet it occupies a surprisingly influential position in one of the country's most specialized chemical markets. To understand why institutional investors have recently begun paying closer attention to it, we first need to travel back to the beginning. How did this company start? What exactly does it manufacture? Who buys its products? And why has a seemingly ordinary chemical business suddenly become part of a much bigger industrial story? That is where our journey truly begins. From an unknown chemical factory to India's boron specialist. Every successful business begins by solving a problem. The question is, what problem was Indo Borax trying to solve? When most people hear the word chemical company, they imagine giant refineries, endless pipelines, hazardous factories, and products that sound too technical to understand. But in reality, many chemical businesses are much simpler than they appear. Think about baking a cake. The flour isn't what makes one bakery famous. Every bakery can buy flour. The difference lies in how consistently they mix ingredients, maintain quality, and deliver the same taste every single day. The chemical industry works in much the same way. The raw materials may be available to many companies, but transforming them into products that industries trust year after year is an entirely different challenge. That is where Indo Borax began its journey. The story starts in 1980, a period when India's industrial landscape looked very different from today. India was still operating under what economists often call the license Raj. Manufacturing was heavily regulated. Imports were difficult. Foreign exchange was scarce. Many industrial chemicals that Indian manufacturers needed had to be imported, often at high cost and with long waiting periods. If a factory making glass or ceramics suddenly ran out of a critical chemical, production could stop altogether. Reliability mattered. And domestic manufacturing mattered even more. It was during this period that Indo Borax and Chemicals Ltd was incorporated by Sushil Kumar Jain and Suresh Chandra Agrawal. The founders did not choose to manufacture hundreds of products. Instead, they focused on something much narrower. They decided to specialize in boron chemistry. At first glance, that sounds limiting. Why build a business around just one family of chemicals? Ironically, that narrow focus became one of the company's greatest strengths. Because while the product category appeared small, its applications were enormous. Imagine walking into a modern city. The windows in skyscrapers, the ceramic tiles in homes, the fertilizers helping farmers grow crops, the medicines used in hospitals, the fiberglass used in infrastructure, the steel strengthening bridges. Many of these products have one invisible ingredient somewhere in their manufacturing process. That ingredient is often boron. And Indo Borax decided to become an expert in exactly that niche. Instead of becoming a general chemical manufacturer, it became a specialist. Just as you would trust a heart surgeon more than a general physician for a complicated operation. Industries often trust specialists when quality becomes critical. Initially, the company established its manufacturing operations in Asangao, Maharashtra, where it began producing boric acid and borax. These names sound technical, but let's simplify them. Think of borax as raw dough. Boric acid is one of the finished products made from that dough. Different industries require different forms of boron depending on how they intend to use it. Some need agricultural-grade material. Some require industrial-grade quality. Others demand pharmaceutical-grade purity. Each customer has different expectations. The challenge isn't merely producing chemicals. The challenge is producing exactly the right chemical, with exactly the right purity. Every single time. Consistency becomes the product. As the years passed, Indo Borax quietly built relationships with customers. That subtle difference shapes the entire business model. To understand Indo Borax, it helps to think less like a stock market investor and more like a restaurant owner. Imagine you're operating one of the busiest restaurants in a city. Every morning, Fresh vegetables arrive from your supplier. If today's vegetables are different from yesterday's, your customers notice immediately. Now imagine replacing vegetables with chemicals. Factories operate the same way. Industrial customers cannot afford inconsistency. A slightly different chemical composition can affect an entire production line. That is why long-term relationships become valuable assets. Over 4 decades, Indo Borax gradually built exactly those relationships. The company wasn't merely selling chemicals. It was selling predictability. As manufacturing expanded across India, so did the company's product portfolio. Today, Indo Borax manufactures several boron-based products. The flagship product remains boric acid. This is the backbone of the business. But the company also produces technical-grade boric acid, used across industries like ceramics, glass, metallurgy, flame retardants, and specialty chemicals. Pharmaceutical-grade boric acid, a much more specialized product. This requires exceptionally high purity standards. In fact, Indo Borax is the only manufacturer in India producing Indian pharmacopoeia-grade boric acid with both FDA and BIS approvals. That may sound like just another regulatory achievement. It isn't. Think about earning a pilot's license. Many people can drive a car. Far fewer can fly a commercial aircraft. Regulatory approvals work similarly. They create barriers that cannot be crossed overnight. Building factories may take money. Building regulatory trust takes years. Another important product is disodium octabarate tetrahydrate, thankfully shortened to DOT. Despite the intimidating name, its purpose is surprisingly simple. Farmers require micronutrients just as humans require vitamins. Plants don't survive on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium alone. They also require tiny quantities of micronutrients. Boron is one of them. DOT acts as a boron-based agricultural micronutrient. It improves crop health, flowering, fruit quality, and yield. Interestingly, the same chemical also finds applications in fire retardants, wood preservation, and industrial formulations. One product, multiple industries. That diversification reduces dependence on any single customer category. The company has also entered boron oxide, another value-added product used in advanced industrial applications, including fiberglass and specialty chemicals. Notice the pattern. Indo Borax is gradually moving up the value chain. Imagine a farmer. Selling raw wheat earns one level of income. Converting wheat into flour earns more. Turning flour into packaged branded food creates even greater value. The same economic principle applies here. Instead of remaining only a processor of basic boron chemicals, the company is steadily increasing the proportion of higher value products. That shift matters because value-added products generally earn better margins. Manufacturing eventually shifted to a modern integrated facility at Pithampur in Madhya Pradesh, one of India's major industrial hubs. Today, the plant has an installed capacity of approximately 20,000 metric tons of boric acid annually and 6,000 metric tons of DOT annually. Capacity numbers often sound boring, but think of them as seating capacity in a restaurant. A restaurant serving 50 customers daily has limited earning potential. The same restaurant serving 500 customers can generate much higher revenue provided demand exists. Factory capacity works the same way. Capacity determines how much business a company can potentially do. Utilization determines how efficiently it uses that capacity. One interesting aspect of Indo Borax's business is that it doesn't rely on one giant customer. Its products reach multiple industries: steel manufacturers, glass producers, ceramic companies, agricultural businesses, pharmaceutical manufacturers, construction material producers, personal care companies, industrial chemical processors. This diversification creates resilience. Imagine owning a shopping mall instead of a single shop. If one tenant struggles, others continue paying rent. Likewise, when one end-use industry slows, demand from another may remain stable. the business becomes less fragile. Geographically, Indo Borax remains predominantly focused on India. That isn't necessarily a weakness. India itself is becoming one of the fastest growing industrial markets in the world. As domestic manufacturing expands, local demand for specialty chemicals also rises. Rather than chasing uncertain international markets too early, the company has historically concentrated on serving Indian industries, where it understands customer one of Warren Buffett's favorite mental models applies perfectly here. Success doesn't always come from doing more. Often, it comes from doing a few things exceptionally well. But perhaps the biggest change in the company's history didn't occur inside its factory. It happened inside its shareholding. For decades, Indo Borax remained promoter-led. Then, in January 2026, something remarkable happened. The founding promoter group transferred approximately 50.8% of the company's equity to a consortium led by Zenrock Chemicals, together with India Special Assets Fund 3 and Special Situation India Fund. For many investors, such an event immediately raises concern. Has something gone wrong? Why would promoters sell? But ownership transitions are not always signs of weakness. Sometimes they represent the beginning of a completely new chapter. The new owners have articulated ambitions around operational excellence, geographic expansion, downstream integration, and innovation-led growth. The company has also brought in an experienced professional leadership team, including Managing Director Suresh Kalra, who has spent nearly 3 decades leading businesses at global chemical companies. Whether those ambitions translate into results remains to be seen. Because business history teaches an important lesson. Buying a company is easy. Improving it is much harder. Markets often reward promises immediately, but they reward execution only after years of consistent delivery. That is why the next few years may prove more important than the previous 40. Are requirements deeply. Sometimes staying within your circle of competence creates better long-term outcomes than expanding too aggressively. So what have we learned? Indo Borax is not simply a chemical manufacturer. It is a specialist built around one family of chemicals that quietly powers multiple industries. Its strength lies in focus rather than diversification. Its customers value consistency more than low prices. Its product portfolio is gradually moving toward higher value applications. Its manufacturing capabilities have been built patiently over 4 decades. And today, after a historic ownership transition, the company stands at the beginning of what could become an entirely new phase of its evolution. But even the best managed company cannot escape the economics of its industry. Some industries naturally create extraordinary wealth. Others destroy it. Some reward scale. Others reward innovation. Some are protected by regulation. Others face relentless competition. So before we can judge Indo Borax's future, we must step back and understand the battlefield on which it competes. How large is the boron market? Why is demand expected to grow? Who controls the global supply? And where exactly does India fit into this complex industrial ecosystem? That is the story waiting for us in the next chapter. The industry, why an invisible mineral is becoming strategically important. History has a strange habit of repeating itself. Every industrial revolution creates new heroes. But before it creates heroes, it creates demand for materials that nobody notices. When people think about industrial revolutions, they usually remember the products that changed the world. Steam engines, railways, automobiles, computers, smartphones, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence. These inventions become famous because people can see them. But behind every technological revolution lies another story. The story of the raw materials that quietly made those revolutions possible. Without iron, there was no railway. Without crude oil, there was no automobile age. Without silicon, there was no computer revolution. And today, as the world enters another phase of industrial transformation, one family of materials is quietly becoming more important than ever. Among them is boron. Not because consumers suddenly want to buy boron, but because industries increasingly cannot function efficiently without it. To understand why Indo Borax matters, we first need to understand the industry it operates in. Because great companies rarely grow faster than the industries supporting them. Imagine standing inside a giant manufacturing ecosystem. In one corner, molten steel is being poured into gigantic molds. Across the road, another factory manufactures ceramic tiles. A few kilometers away, fertilizer companies prepare micronutrients for agriculture. Nearby, pharmaceutical companies produce medical formulations. Another plant manufactures fiberglass. Another produces detergents. Another produces flame-retardant materials. At first glance, these factories seem completely unrelated. Different products, different customers, different technologies. But hidden inside many of them is one common ingredient: boron. This is what economists call a horizontal industry. Instead of serving one customer segment, it serves dozens simultaneously. Think about electricity. Electricity doesn't belong to one industry. Every industry uses electricity. Boron behaves in a similar way. It quietly supports multiple sectors at once. That diversity makes the market surprisingly resilient. Globally, boron is considered a strategic industrial mineral. Unlike iron ore or coal, it isn't mined everywhere. Nature has been selective. Large commercial boron reserves are concentrated in only a handful of countries. Turkey possesses some of the world's largest reserves. The United States is another major producer. Smaller quantities come from countries like Argentina and Peru. India, despite its enormous industrial base, has very limited natural boron reserves. That simple geological fact shapes the entire Indian industry. Imagine opening a bakery in a city where wheat cannot be grown. Every bag of flour must be imported. You can still build a successful bakery, but your efficiency now depends on how well you manage imports, logistics, inventory, processing, and customer relationships. Indian boron manufacturers operate under a similar constraint. The raw mineral often travels thousands of kilometers before it even reaches Indian factories. Value is created not by mining, but by processing. This distinction is important. Many investors assume mining companies and specialty chemical companies are the same. They aren't. A mining company primarily extracts raw materials. A specialty chemical company transforms those materials into products with much higher industrial value. Think about coffee. Growing coffee beans is one business. Roasting them is another. Creating a premium coffee brand is yet another. Each stage creates additional value. Indo Borax operates much closer to the premium coffee brand than to the coffee plantation. Its competitive advantage depends on chemistry, quality control, manufacturing precision, and customer trust, not ownership of mines. That changes the economics of the business. Now let's look at demand. Why is boron consumption increasing? The answer lies in something much bigger than chemistry. It lies in the way economies develop. Imagine a village slowly transforming into a city. The first requirement is roads, then buildings, then factories, then hospitals, then schools, then shopping malls, then automobiles, then electronics. Each stage requires more industrial materials than the previous one. As countries become wealthier, their consumption of specialty materials rises almost automatically. India today finds itself in exactly that transition. Urbanization continues. Infrastructure spending remains massive. Manufacturing capacity is expanding. Renewable energy installations are accelerating. Construction activity remains strong. Every one of these trends quietly increases demand for boron-based products. Take steel as an example. India has ambitious infrastructure goals. Expressways, railways, metro systems, ports, industrial corridors, data centers, factories, all require steel. Steel itself consumes boron in various specialized applications. The more India builds, the greater the indirect demand. Notice something interesting. Indo Borax doesn't need consumers to buy boric acid directly. It simply needs India to continue industrializing. That's a very different type of demand driver. Agriculture provides another example. Most people think fertilizers consist only of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are indeed the major nutrients. But plants, much like humans, require vitamins too, only in tiny quantities. Boron acts like one of those essential vitamins. Without adequate boron, crops may flower poorly, fruit quality can deteriorate, and yields can suffer. India, with one of the world's largest agricultural sectors, increasingly recognizes the importance of balanced nutrition rather than merely adding more fertilizer. As awareness improves, micronutrient demand rises. That creates another independent growth engine. Notice how different this demand is from steel. One depends on infrastructure. The other depends on agriculture. Yet both consume boron. Diversification begins at the industry level itself. Healthcare creates a third demand stream. Pharmaceutical-grade boric acid requires exceptionally high purity. Hospitals and pharmaceutical manufacturers cannot compromise on quality. A slight impurity acceptable in an industrial application may become unacceptable in medicine. That is why regulatory approvals such as FDA and BIS certifications become valuable. They transform an ordinary chemical into a trusted medical input. Demand here isn't driven by economic cycles alone. It is driven by healthcare needs. Again, another independent growth driver. Then comes renewable energy. This is where second-order thinking becomes useful. Suppose someone tells you India plans to install more solar panels. Your first thought may be, good news for solar companies. But think one step further. Solar panels require specialized glass. Glass manufacturing consumes boron compounds. So increased solar installations indirectly support boron demand. This is called second-order thinking. The first effect is obvious. The second effect often creates the investment opportunity. The same applies to electric vehicles, battery factories, charging infrastructure, industrial automation, advanced materials. Many of these sectors quietly consume specialty chemicals somewhere along their manufacturing chain. Government policy strengthens these structural trends. Over the last decade, India has introduced multiple initiatives aimed at increasing domestic manufacturing. Make in India encourages local production. Atmanirbhar Bharat focuses on reducing import dependence across strategic industries. The Production-Linked Incentive (PLI) schemes encourage investments in sectors such as electronics, pharmaceuticals, advanced chemistry cells, solar manufacturing, and specialty manufacturing. The National Infrastructure Pipeline and PM Gati Shakti aim to modernize logistics, roads, railways, ports, and industrial connectivity. Individually, these policies target different sectors. Collectively, they create one powerful outcome. They increase industrial activity, and industrial activity increases chemical demand. This is why specialty chemical companies often benefit not from one policy, but from the cumulative effect of many. Of course, industries never move in straight lines. Every industry has cycles. The boron industry is no exception. Commodity prices fluctuate. Global freight costs change. Currency movements affect imported raw materials. Industrial production slows during recessions. Construction demand weakens during economic uncertainty. Farm incomes fluctuate with monsoons. Temporary slowdowns are inevitable. But long-term structural demand can still remain intact. Think about air travel. Passenger numbers fell dramatically during the pandemic. That didn't mean aviation disappeared forever. Short-term cycles and long-term trends often coexist. Understanding the difference separates patient investors from impatient speculators. Now let's discuss one of the industry's most interesting characteristics: entry barriers. Suppose tomorrow you decide to manufacture premium pharmaceutical chemicals. Can you simply rent a building, buy few machines, and begin supplying hospitals? Probably not. Customers need certifications. Factories require regulatory approvals. Quality systems must be validated. Processes require years of refinement. Industrial customers test new suppliers extensively. Switching suppliers introduces risk. The result? The industry naturally protects experienced manufacturers. This doesn't eliminate competition, but it slows it down. Time becomes an economic moat. Another important feature is customer behavior. Industrial customers rarely change suppliers every month. Imagine an automobile manufacturer. If changing a 50 rupee chemical creates even a 1% risk of disrupting production worth hundreds of crores, would they switch simply to save a little money? Probably not. Reliability often matters more than the last percentage point of cost savings. However, no industry is perfect. The boron industry also faces headwinds. India's dependence on imported boron minerals means manufacturers remain exposed to geopolitical developments, a disruption in global shipping routes, currency depreciation, trade restrictions, unexpected increases in freight costs. All can influence profitability. Environmental regulations also continue evolving. Chemical manufacturers must continuously invest in safety, compliance, and sustainability. Failure to adapt can quickly destroy decades of reputation. And finally, pricing remains influenced by global supply-demand dynamics. Even companies with excellent execution cannot completely escape macroeconomic forces. The sea affects every ship. Some ships simply navigate storms better than others. So where exactly does Indo Borax fit within this landscape? It isn't the world's largest boron producer, nor does it control global mineral reserves. Instead, it occupies a more focused and strategically valuable position. It is one of India's leading processors of boron-based specialty chemicals. It serves multiple industries rather than depending on one. It possesses specialized regulatory approvals that few competitors can match. And it operates in an industry benefiting from several long-term structural tailwinds linked to India's manufacturing ambitions. That creates opportunity. But opportunity alone never guarantees dominance. Because every attractive industry attracts competition. Some companies compete through lower prices, others through better quality, some through larger scale, others through technology. Customers always have choices, which raises the next question. If several companies can manufacture chemicals, why do customers choose one over another? Why does one company earn superior margins while another struggles? What determines who survives and who disappears? To answer that, we now step onto the competitive battlefield. Because understanding the industry tells us where the game is played. Understanding competition tells us who is most likely to win. The competitive battlefield. Why winning in chemicals is harder than it looks. In business, success isn't determined by how good you think you are. It is determined by whether customers believe they need you tomorrow, even if another supplier knocks on their door today. Imagine walking into a supermarket. You pick up a bottle of drinking water. On the next shelf sits another bottle. Then another. Then another. At first glance, they're all selling the same thing, water. Yet some brands charge twice as much as others. And millions of people willingly pay the difference. Why? Because when products begin to look similar, trust becomes part of the product. The chemical industry works exactly the same way. From the outside, one bag of boric acid may look almost identical to another. They're both white powders. They're both packed in similar bags. They may even carry similar purity specifications. But to the customer running a 5,000 rupees crore manufacturing plant, they are not interchangeable. One supplier has supplied consistently for 15 years. The other is completely unknown. Changing suppliers isn't just changing a vendor. It's changing a process. It's changing quality assurance. It's changing risk. And in manufacturing, risk is expensive. That simple idea explains why competition in specialty chemicals is very different from competition in ordinary commodity businesses. To understand Indo Borax's competitive position, let's first identify its rivals. Unlike consumer businesses, where competitors are familiar household names, Indo Borax competes in a relatively specialized segment of the chemical industry. Some of its listed peers include companies like Tanfic Industries, GNFC, GHCL, Tata Chemicals, Deepak Fertilizers, and SRF. At first glance, these appear to be direct competitors. But they are not identical businesses. Think of the automobile industry. Mercedes, Ashok Leyland, Caterpillar, and John Deere all manufacture vehicles. Yet they solve completely different problems. Comparing them solely because they make vehicles would be misleading. The same principle applies here. Large diversified chemical companies manufacture hundreds of products. Indo Borax, on the other hand, focuses deeply on boron chemistry. It isn't trying to become India's largest chemical company. It is trying to become one of India's best boron specialists. That distinction matters. Imagine two bookstores. One sells every book ever published. The other sells only medical textbooks. The first attracts more visitors. The second attracts experts. When a hospital needs a specialized medical reference, it doesn't necessarily visit the largest bookstore. It visits the most knowledgeable one. Specialization often beats size in niche industries. Indo Borax has spent more than 4 decades building exactly that specialization. Today, the company commands approximately 50% of India's boric acid market, making it one of the country's leading domestic players. That isn't simply a statistic. It reflects years of customer relationships, manufacturing know-how, and regulatory credibility. However, market share alone doesn't guarantee future success. Kodak once dominated photography. Nokia once dominated mobile phones. Leadership is only valuable if it evolves. Which is why understanding competition requires going deeper than market share. One of the best frameworks for doing that was developed by Harvard professor Michael Porter. It's called Porter's 5 Forces. Despite its intimidating name, it's actually very intuitive. Let's apply it to Indo Borax. Force 1. Threat of new entrants. Suppose you decide tomorrow to compete with Indo Borax. Can you simply rent a warehouse, buy a few machines, and start selling boric acid? Technically, perhaps. Successfully? That's a different story. Building a chemical plant requires capital. Obtaining environmental approvals takes time. Creating consistent manufacturing processes takes years. Winning customer trust takes even longer. For pharmaceutical-grade products, regulatory approvals become another significant hurdle. Imagine opening a new airline. Buying airplanes isn't enough. Passengers must trust your safety. Similarly, industrial customers trust suppliers only after repeated proof of quality. This makes entry possible, but difficult. Time itself becomes a barrier. Force 2. Bargaining power of suppliers. Here, Indo Borax faces a genuine challenge. Remember our earlier discussion? India possesses very limited boron mineral reserves. Much of the raw material comes from countries like Turkey and the United States. Imagine running a bakery that depends entirely on imported flour. If shipping costs suddenly double, or exchange rates weaken, your costs immediately rise. You may not have done anything wrong, yet your profitability changes. Indo Borax operates under similar constraints. Its upstream suppliers poses meaningful bargaining power because alternative global sources are limited. Fortunately, decades of sourcing relationships and operational experience help reduce some of that risk, but they cannot eliminate it entirely. Force 3. Bargaining power of customers. Now let's examine the opposite side. Can customers easily pressure Indo Borax into reducing prices? The answer depends on who the customer is. Large industrial manufacturers naturally negotiate aggressively. Every procurement department wants lower costs. But here's the interesting part. Chemicals often represent only a tiny fraction of the customer's total production cost. Suppose a glass manufacturer produces 1,000 crore rupees worth of glass every year. The boric acid purchased may account for only a small percentage of total costs. If switching suppliers saves a little money but increases the risk of production problems, most customers choose stability. The cost of failure is often much larger than the cost of the chemical itself. That reduces customer bargaining power, particularly where quality and consistency matter. Force 4. Threat of substitutes. Can another material replace boron? In certain applications, engineers continuously search for alternatives. But many boron-based applications poses unique chemical properties that are difficult to replicate economically. Think of salt. There are many seasonings, but when a recipe specifically requires salt, replacing it completely changes the outcome. Similarly, while substitute technologies may emerge over time, many boron applications remain difficult to replace without compromising performance. This gives the industry reasonable protection. Not perfect, but meaningful. Force 5. Rivalry among existing competitors. This is where things become interesting. Competition certainly exists. Large diversified chemical companies poses greater financial resources. Global suppliers poses scale. Imports remain available. Yet rivalry isn't purely about who has the largest balance sheet. It's about who solves customer problems better. Indo Borax competes through specialization. Large diversified companies compete through breadth. International suppliers compete through global scale. Each follows a different strategy. No single strategy wins everywhere. One fascinating aspect of specialty chemicals is pricing power. Most people misunderstand this concept. Pricing power doesn't mean raising prices whenever you like. It means customers willingly continue buying despite reasonable price increases because the product remains critical. Imagine your smartphone charger. Would you risk damaging a 1 lakh rupees phone by purchasing the cheapest possible charger? Probably not. Reliability matters. Industrial customers think similarly. If a trusted chemical supplier increases prices modestly due to higher raw material costs, many customers accept it because the cost of disruption is far greater. That creates a healthier business than one constantly forced into price wars. Another powerful force is switching cost. Let's use a simple analogy. Suppose you've been visiting the same family doctor for 15 years. The doctor understands your medical history, knows your allergies, recognizes your family's health patterns. Would you change doctors simply because another clinic charges 100 rupees less? Probably not. The relationship itself has value. Manufacturing customers develop similar relationships with chemical suppliers. Factories optimize production using specific formulations. Quality teams validate suppliers. Processes become standardized. Changing suppliers means repeating many of those steps. That consumes time, money, and management attention. These hidden costs create customer stickiness, not because contracts force loyalty, but because changing isn't worth the risk. Customer behavior in this industry also differs from consumer markets. Consumers often buy emotionally. Industrial buyers buy rationally, or at least they try to. Their decision process revolves around 5 questions. Will the product perform consistently? Can the supplier deliver on time? Does the supplier meet regulatory standards? Will quality remain stable? Can the supplier scale with future demand? Notice something missing. The lowest price isn't necessarily the first question. For mission-critical inputs, certainty often outweighs marginal savings. Competition, however, isn't static. The chemical industry is constantly evolving. Global environmental standards become stricter. Customers demand higher purity. New applications emerge. Sustainability expectations rise. Companies unable to innovate gradually lose relevance. Interestingly, Indo Borax's recent ownership transition may influence this competitive equation. The new management has spoken about geographic expansion, downstream integration, operational optimization, and innovation-led growth. If executed well, these initiatives could strengthen the company's competitive position. If execution falls short, competitors will quickly exploit the gap. Business history repeatedly teaches the same lesson. Markets reward execution, not ambition. So where does that leave Indo Borax? It operates in a niche rather than a mass market. It possesses meaningful domestic scale. It enjoys long-standing customer relationships. It has regulatory advantages in pharmaceutical-grade products. Its customers face meaningful switching costs. Yet it also depends on imported raw materials and competes with larger global and diversified chemical players. In other words, the company is neither invincible nor vulnerable. It occupies a competitive position that has been patiently built over 4 decades. But competition alone never explains why one business consistently earns superior returns. Some companies face identical competitors. One thrives, another struggles. The difference often lies in something much deeper. Something Warren Buffett famously calls an economic moat. A moat is what allows a business to protect its profits even when competitors know exactly what it is doing. So the next question naturally emerges. What truly protects Indo Borax? Is it merely manufacturing capacity? Or has the company built advantages that become stronger with time? That is the story we explore in the next chapter, where we look beyond competition and uncover the invisible strengths that determine whether a business can compound wealth for decades or slowly lose its edge. Its upstream suppliers poses meaningful bargaining power because alternative global sources are limited. Fortunately, decades of sourcing relationships and operational experience help reduce some of that risk, but they cannot eliminate it entirely. Force 3. Bargaining power of customers. Now let's examine the opposite side. Can customers easily pressure Indo Borax into reducing prices? The answer depends on who the customer is. Large industrial manufacturers naturally negotiate aggressively. Every procurement department wants lower costs. But here's the interesting part. Chemicals often represent only a tiny fraction of the customer's total production cost. Suppose a glass manufacturer produces 1,000 crore rupees worth of glass every year. The boric acid purchased may account for only a small percentage of total costs. If switching suppliers saves a little money but increases the risk of production problems, most customers choose stability. The cost of failure is often much larger than the cost of the chemical itself. That reduces customer bargaining power, particularly where quality and consistency matter. Force 4. Threat of substitutes. Can another material replace boron? In certain applications, engineers continuously search for alternatives. But many boron-based applications poses unique chemical properties that are difficult to replicate economically. Think of salt. There are many seasonings, but when a recipe specifically requires salt, replacing it completely changes the outcome. Similarly, while substitute technologies may emerge over time, many boron applications remain difficult to replace without compromising performance. This gives the industry reasonable protection. Not perfect, but meaningful. Force 5. Rivalry among existing competitors. This is where things become interesting. Competition certainly exists. Large diversified chemical companies poses greater financial resources. Global suppliers poses scale. Imports remain available. Yet rivalry isn't purely about who has the largest balance sheet. It's about who solves customer problems better. Indo Borax competes through specialization. Large diversified companies compete through breadth. International suppliers compete through global scale. Each follows a different strategy. No single strategy wins everywhere. One fascinating aspect of specialty chemicals is pricing power. Most people misunderstand this concept. Pricing power doesn't mean raising prices whenever you like. It means customers willingly continue buying despite reasonable price increases because the product remains critical. Imagine your smartphone charger. Would you risk damaging a 1 lakh rupees phone By purchasing the cheapest possible charger? Probably not. Reliability matters. Industrial customers think similarly. If a trusted chemical supplier increases prices modestly due to higher raw material costs, many customers accept it because the cost of disruption is far greater. That creates a healthier business than one constantly forced into price wars. Another powerful force is switching cost. Let's use a simple analogy. Suppose you've been visiting the same family doctor for 15 years. The doctor understands your medical history, knows your allergies, recognizes your family's health patterns. Would you change doctors simply because another clinic charges 100 rupees less? Probably not. The relationship itself has value. Manufacturing customers develop similar relationships with chemical suppliers. Factories optimize production using specific formulations. Quality teams validate suppliers. Processes become standardized. Changing suppliers means repeating many of those steps. That consumes time, money, and management attention. These hidden costs create customer stickiness. Not because contracts force loyalty, but because changing isn't worth the risk. Customer behavior in this industry also differs from consumer markets. Consumers often buy emotionally. Industrial buyers buy rationally. Or at least they try to. Their decision process revolves around 5 questions. Will the product perform consistently? Can the supplier deliver on time? Does the supplier meet regulatory standards? Will quality remain stable? Can the supplier scale with future demand? Notice something missing. The lowest price isn't necessarily the first question. For mission-critical inputs, certainty often outweighs marginal savings. Competition, however, isn't static. The chemical industry is constantly evolving. Global environmental standards become stricter. Customers demand higher purity. New applications emerge. Sustainability expectations rise. Companies unable to innovate gradually lose relevance. Interestingly, Indo Borax's recent ownership transition may influence this competitive equation. The new management has spoken about geographic expansion, downstream integration, operational optimization, and innovation-led growth. If executed well, these initiatives could strengthen the company's competitive position. If execution falls short, competitors will quickly exploit the gap. Business history repeatedly teaches the same lesson. Markets reward execution, not ambition. So where does that leave Indo Borax? It operates in a niche rather than a mass market. It possesses meaningful domestic scale. It enjoys long-standing customer relationships. It has regulatory advantages in pharmaceutical-grade products. Its customers face meaningful switching costs. Yet it also depends on imported raw materials and competes with larger global and diversified chemical players. In other words, the company is neither invincible nor vulnerable. It occupies a competitive position that has been patiently built over 4 decades. But competition alone never explains why one business consistently earns superior returns. Some companies face identical competitors. One thrives, another struggles. The difference often lies in something much deeper, something Warren Buffett famously calls an economic moat. A moat is what allows a business to protect its profits even when competitors know exactly what it is doing. So the next question naturally emerges. What truly protects Indo Borax? Is it merely manufacturing capacity? Or has the company built advantages that become stronger with time? That is the story we explore in the next chapter, where we look beyond competition and uncover the invisible strengths that determine whether a business can compound wealth for decades or slowly lose its edge. The invisible castle. What really protects Indo Borax? Every successful business eventually faces the same question. If your products are valuable, why doesn't someone simply copy you? Imagine you discover a small restaurant tucked away in a quiet corner of a city. It doesn't have glamorous interiors. It isn't located inside a luxury mall. It spends almost nothing on advertising. Yet every evening, customers willingly wait outside for nearly an hour just to get a table. Across the street sits another restaurant with similar furniture, similar prices, and even similar ingredients. But it's half empty. Why? The answer isn't the building. It isn't the chairs. It isn't even the kitchen. The answer lies in something invisible. Years of trust, consistency, reputation, recipes refined over decades, customers who know exactly what to expect. Economists call this an economic moat. Like the water-filled moat surrounding medieval castles, it doesn't make the castle impossible to attack. It simply makes attacking much more difficult. Businesses with strong moats can survive competition for decades. Businesses without moats constantly fight for survival. So where does Indo Borax stand? Does it have a moat? Or is it simply benefiting from temporary industry tailwinds? Let's walk around the castle and examine every wall. The first wall, specialization instead of size. One of the biggest misconceptions in investing is that bigger companies always have stronger businesses. History tells a different story. The world's largest hospital isn't necessarily the best heart hospital. The largest law firm isn't necessarily the best tax advisor. Sometimes specialization defeats scale. Indo Borax made a strategic choice more than 4 decades ago. Instead of becoming another diversified chemical company manufacturing hundreds of products, it concentrated on one family of chemicals: boron. That decision may have looked limiting in the beginning, but over time, focus became expertise. Expertise became reputation, and reputation became customer trust. Imagine learning one musical instrument for 45 years instead of learning 20 instruments for 2 years each. Who would you rather hire for a concert? This is the learning curve at work. Every additional year improves knowledge. Every customer problem teaches something new. Every manufacturing challenge strengthens operational know-how. Over decades, experience compounds. Just like money. The second wall, trust built one shipment at a time. Think about what happens inside a pharmaceutical factory. Every batch is tested. Every ingredient is verified. Every process follows strict quality standards. Now imagine the supplier suddenly delivers inconsistent raw material. The consequences could be enormous. Factories don't simply buy chemicals. They buy reliability. One reason Indo Borax has remained relevant for over 40 years is that it has quietly built long-term relationships with customers across multiple industries. These relationships didn't appear overnight. They were built one shipment at a time, one successful delivery after another. Trust is one of the few business assets that cannot be purchased. It must be earned. And once earned, it often becomes self-reinforcing. Customers hesitate to change suppliers. New customers gain confidence because existing customers stay. This creates a powerful feedback loop. The more trusted the company becomes, the easier it becomes to win future business. The third wall, regulatory approvals. One of Indo Borax's strongest competitive advantages receives surprisingly little attention. The company is the only Indian manufacturer of Indian pharmacopoeia-grade boric acid with FDA and BIS approvals. At first glance, that sounds like a regulatory detail. It isn't. Imagine opening a school. Anyone can rent classrooms. But becoming a university recognized across the world requires years of accreditation, inspections, compliance, and reputation. Factories operate similarly. Producing industrial-grade chemicals is one challenge. Producing pharmaceutical-grade chemicals that satisfy regulators is another. Regulatory approvals act like invisible walls around the business. Competitors can build factories, but they cannot instantly build regulatory credibility. Time itself becomes part of the moat. The fourth wall, manufacturing know-how. Let's imagine two chefs. Both receive identical ingredients. Both use identical kitchens. Yet one consistently produces better food. Why? Because recipes are only part of cooking. Timing matters. Temperature matters. Experience matters. The chemical industry works exactly the same way. Manufacturing chemicals isn't simply mixing ingredients together. Tiny variations in temperature, pressure, purity, or processing conditions can affect the final product. These processes improve gradually through years of learning. Economists call this the learning curve. Every year of manufacturing teaches lessons competitors cannot download from the internet. This accumulated operational knowledge quietly strengthens the business. The fifth wall, customer switching costs. Suppose you're responsible for purchasing chemicals for a large steel manufacturer. A new supplier approaches you. They promise to reduce your chemical costs by 5%. Sounds attractive. But then your quality team asks several questions. Will their product behave exactly the same? Will production need recalibration? Will quality certifications need updating? Could production be interrupted? Could customer complaints increase? Suddenly, that 5% saving no longer looks very attractive. This is what economists call a switching cost. Notice something important. Customers aren't locked in by legal contracts. They're locked in by practical realities. Changing suppliers creates work, creates uncertainty, creates risk, and businesses usually avoid unnecessary risk. This gives established suppliers an advantage that doesn't appear anywhere on the balance sheet. The sixth wall, economies of scale. Now imagine two bakeries. One produces 100 loaves every day. Another produces 10,000. Both pay similar salaries to managers. Both maintain quality laboratories. Both purchase packaging. Both manage logistics. But the larger bakery spreads these fixed costs across many more products. Each loaf becomes cheaper to produce. Factories work the same way. Indo Borax operates one of India's largest boric acid capacities, around 20,000 metric tons annually, along with 6,000 metric tons of dot capacity. Larger production volumes can improve cost efficiency when plants run at higher utilization. However, scale creates advantages only when demand exists. Empty factories don't create wealth. Efficiently utilized factories do. The seventh wall, operating leverage. This brings us to another powerful concept, operating leverage. Imagine owning a movie theater. Whether 20 people watch the movie or 200, many costs remain unchanged. The building rent doesn't suddenly double. The projector doesn't consume 10 times more electricity. As ticket sales rise, profits often increase faster than revenue. Chemical plants behave similarly. Once a factory has been built, increasing production can significantly improve profitability because many fixed costs are already covered. This is why management has repeatedly emphasized improving capacity utilization and operational efficiency as drivers of recent financial performance. The factory becomes more productive without necessarily becoming much larger. The eighth wall, distribution and relationships. Unlike consumer companies, Indo Borax doesn't sell products through television advertisements or supermarket shelves. Its distribution network is built around industrial relationships developed over decades. Imagine supplying ingredients to hundreds of restaurants. The relationship doesn't end after one delivery. It continues every week, every month, every year. The company's established distributor and customer network across India allows it to serve industries ranging from steel and ceramics to pharmaceuticals and agriculture. Distribution, in this context, isn't about trucks. It's about relationships. The ninth wall, capital allocation. A great business can still destroy shareholder wealth if management allocates capital poorly. Think of a farmer. One farmer spends every rupee buying more land at inflated prices. Another invests in irrigation, better seeds, and soil improvement. Both spend money, but only one creates long-term value. Capital allocation works exactly the same way. Historically, Indo Borax has remained virtually debt-free, generated positive free cash flow over long periods, and returned cash through dividends. That reflects a relatively conservative approach. However, a new chapter has now begun. Following the 2026 ownership transition, Investors are no longer evaluating only the factory. They are evaluating the capital allocation philosophy of the new owners. Will they pursue acquisitions? Will they expand capacity? Will they invest in downstream products? Will they maintain financial discipline? The moat may remain, but management determines whether it widens or narrows. The 10th wall, behavioral advantage. Perhaps the most overlooked moat is psychological. Most investors chase excitement, artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, space technology, quantum computing. Meanwhile, companies quietly manufacturing industrial inputs often receive little attention, until suddenly they don't. Behavioral finance calls this narrative investing. Markets periodically fall in love with stories, then abandon them, then rediscover them. Indo Borax has spent decades outside the spotlight. Its recent ownership change, improving financial performance, and stronger market visibility have begun attracting new investor attention. The risk is that investors may now become overly enthusiastic. Strong businesses deserve attention, but excessive expectations can become dangerous. A great company purchased at unrealistic expectations often produces disappointing investment returns. The moat protects the business. It doesn't necessarily protect the investor from overpaying. Is the moat strengthening or weakening? This is the most important question. Looking backward, Indo Borax has several enduring strengths. More than 4 decades of operating experience. Leadership in India's boron market. Long-standing customer relationships. Regulatory approvals that are difficult to replicate. A debt-light balance sheet. Specialized manufacturing expertise. Diversified industrial applications. These strengths suggest the company has built a meaningful economic moat. But moats are not permanent monuments. They require maintenance. The ownership transition in 2026 represents both an opportunity and a test. The incoming leadership has outlined ambitions around geographic expansion, operational optimization, downstream integration, and innovation-led growth. If these ambitions are executed successfully, the moat could become deeper over the next decade. If execution falters, competitors may gradually erode the company's advantages. History reminds us that businesses rarely lose their moats overnight. They lose them slowly. One customer at a time. One poor capital allocation decision at a time. One missed opportunity at a time. The opposite is equally true. Strong management can deepen a moat gradually through disciplined execution. So what have we learned? Indo Borax's greatest strengths are not hidden inside its factory walls. They are embedded in decades of accumulated experience, regulatory credibility, customer trust, specialized manufacturing knowledge, and disciplined operations. These advantages help explain why the company has remained relevant in a niche industry for more than 40 years. But every moat eventually faces a simple test. Can it produce superior financial results? Because at the end of the day, businesses don't create shareholder wealth through stories. They create it through cash flows, through returns on capital, through disciplined reinvestment, through efficient operations. In the next chapter, we leave the factory floor and enter the financial statements, not to memorize numbers, but to decode what those numbers reveal about the health of the business and whether the economic moat we've just explored is actually visible in the company's financial performance. Reading the numbers, the financial story behind Indo Borax. Financial statements are often treated like scoreboards, but in reality, they are diaries. Every number tells the story of a business decision made months or even years earlier. Imagine you're standing outside two restaurants. Both are full. Both have customers waiting. Both appear equally successful. But when you step inside the kitchen, you discover something surprising. One restaurant is making excellent profits. The other is barely surviving. Why? Because appearances can be deceptive. The first owner controls costs carefully, wastes very little food, and earns a healthy margin on every meal served. The second owner spends too much, manages inventory poorly, and borrows heavily just to keep the lights on. From the street, they look identical. From the accounts, they are worlds apart. The same principle applies to companies. A rising share price tells you what the market believes today. Financial statements tell you what the business has actually achieved. Now that we've understood Indo Borax's business model and its competitive position, it's time to ask a more important question. Does the financial evidence support the story? Because in investing, stories attract attention. Cash flows create wealth. Revenue. Is the business actually growing? The first number most investors look at is revenue. It seems obvious. More sales should mean a better business. But reality is more complicated. Imagine a grocery store. One owner doubles sales by offering huge discounts. Customers flood in. Revenue jumps. But profits disappear. Has the business improved? Not really. Now imagine another grocery store. Sales rise more slowly, but customers willingly pay premium prices because they trust the quality. Profits improve. Cash flow improves. That growth is healthier. Revenue only matters when we understand why it changed. For Indo Borax, the revenue story has not been perfectly smooth. During the last few years, sales experienced periods of both expansion and moderation. FY24 saw revenue decline from earlier highs. FY25 remained relatively subdued. Then FY26 marked a meaningful recovery. Revenue increased to approximately 215 crore rupees, representing almost 23% year-on-year growth. Management attributes this improvement to better capacity utilization, operational efficiencies, stronger domestic demand, and improved realizations rather than simply selling more at lower prices. That distinction is important. Growth driven by operational improvement usually proves more durable than growth driven purely by aggressive pricing. Margins. The business is not chasing growth at any cost. Now let's ask another question. Suppose two factories both increase revenue by 20%. One also increases profits. The other sees profits decline. Which business is healthier? Obviously, the first. That is why investors study operating margins. Think of operating margin as the amount left after paying for the ingredients but before paying taxes and financing costs. It's similar to a bakery asking, after buying flour, sugar, electricity, and paying employees, how much money remains from every cake sold. Indo Borax has historically maintained operating margins around 20%. For a specialty chemical company, that indicates reasonable pricing discipline. Even during FY26, despite higher production and changing market conditions, margins remained relatively healthy. This suggests that the company wasn't sacrificing profitability simply to increase sales. Instead, operational improvements appear to have offset part of the cost pressures. Healthy margins usually indicate one of three things. Either customers trust the product, or the company controls costs well, or ideally, both. Profit. Why did earnings improve? Revenue tells us customers are buying. Profit tells us whether management is creating value. FY26 profit after tax increased to around 50 crore rupees, reflecting strong improvement over the previous year. Quarterly profit growth was even stronger, supported by improved plant utilization and better realizations. However, every thoughtful investor should immediately ask another question. Was this improvement entirely operational, or were there other contributors? This is where reading financial statements carefully becomes important. A meaningful portion of FY26 earnings included other income. Other income isn't necessarily bad. Companies may earn interest on investments or realize gains from financial assets. But it isn't the same as earning profits from selling core products. Imagine a restaurant making money by renting out its banquet hall. That income is welcome. But investors still want the restaurant business itself to perform well. Similarly, Indo Borax's core operations have improved, But investors should continue tracking whether future earnings increasingly come from operating performance rather than non-operating income. Return on equity, good, but not extraordinary. One of Warren Buffett's favorite questions is surprisingly simple. If I invest 100 rupees in this business, how efficiently does management grow that money? That is essentially what return on equity, or ROE, measures. Think of it as the productivity of shareholder capital. If two farmers own identical pieces of land, but one consistently harvests twice as much grain, we naturally conclude that one farmer uses resources more efficiently. ROE measures a similar concept. Indo Borax currently generates an ROE of around 12%. This isn't poor, but it also isn't exceptional for a specialty chemical company. Many of the strongest long-term compounders consistently generate ROEs above 18-20%. Why does this matter? Because higher ROE often indicates that management can reinvest profits more efficiently. Lower ROE doesn't automatically make a company unattractive, but it suggests that future compounding may occur at a slower pace unless efficiency improves. ROEs, looking beyond shareholders. Another useful measure is return on capital employed, or ROEs. If ROE asks how efficiently shareholder money is used, ROEs asks a broader question. How efficiently does the entire business use all the capital available to it? Think about opening a hotel. You don't only invest your own savings. You also invest buildings, equipment, furniture, working capital, and other resources. ROEs measures how productive the complete business becomes. Historically, Indo Borax enjoyed ROEs levels close to 30%. More recently, that figure has moderated toward the mid-teens. This doesn't necessarily signal deterioration. Part of the change reflects evolving business conditions and capital deployment. But it does mean investors should monitor whether recent operational improvements eventually translate into stronger capital efficiency. Because a growing business that cannot earn attractive returns on capital eventually destroys value. Debt, one of the strongest parts of the story. Now we arrive at one of Indo Borax's greatest financial strengths. Debt, or more accurately, the absence of it. Imagine two families. Both earn the same salary. One owes huge housing loans, car loans, and credit card debt. The other owns its house outright and has almost no liabilities. Which family sleeps better during difficult economic periods? The answer is obvious. Businesses behave similarly. Indo Borax has maintained a virtually debt-free balance sheet with negligible borrowing and extremely high interest coverage. This provides something extremely valuable: freedom. Management can survive downturns, invest during opportunities, avoid financial distress. Debt isn't always bad, but businesses rarely regret having financial flexibility. Cash flow, the difference between accounting and reality. One of the biggest mistakes new investors make is believing profit automatically equals cash. It doesn't. Imagine selling 10 luxury cars on credit. Your accounting profit looks excellent. But if customers haven't paid you yet, your bank account remains empty. Cash flow measures reality. It asks, how much actual cash entered the business? FY25 was unusual. Operating cash flow turned negative despite profits. That naturally worried investors. But FY26 told a very different story. Operating cash flow recovered sharply to approximately 87 crore rupees, while free cash flow exceeded 100 crore rupees. What changed? The answer lies largely in working capital. Inventory normalized. Collections improved. Operations stabilized. The business once again converted accounting profits into actual cash. And in the long run, cash, not accounting profit, pays dividends, funds expansion, and creates shareholder value. Working capital, one number that needs watching. If there is one financial metric that deserves closer attention, it is working capital. Let's simplify it. Imagine running a grocery store. If too much money sits locked inside unsold inventory, you cannot use that cash elsewhere. Similarly, if customers delay payments, your profits may exist on paper while cash remains unavailable. Historically, Indo Borax improved both debtor days and inventory efficiency. Debtor days fell significantly, suggesting faster customer collections. Inventory also became more efficient. However, reported working capital days increased sharply in FY26. This deserves monitoring. 1 year's data rarely tells the complete story. But investors should understand why this changed and whether it reflects temporary timing effects, inventory strategy, or structural changes in operations. Financial quality is not about ignoring uncomfortable numbers. It is about asking better questions. Dividend, confidence, or constraint? The board declared a 10 rupee final dividend along with a 30 rupee special dividend for FY26. At first glance, shareholders celebrate. Who doesn't enjoy receiving cash? But thoughtful investors ask another question. Should the company distribute cash or reinvest it? There is no universal answer. If management sees outstanding expansion opportunities, retaining capital may create greater long-term value. If attractive investment opportunities are limited, returning excess cash becomes sensible. The challenge for Indo Borax's new management is balancing both priorities. Reward shareholders today, without compromising tomorrow's growth. Shareholding, the story behind ownership. Perhaps no financial number changed more dramatically than promoter ownership. For decades, the company remained promoter-controlled. Then came the historic ownership transition. The original promoter group exited. New investors entered. Professional management took charge. Financially, this changes the lens through which investors evaluate the company. Earlier, investors largely assessed the founders. Now they assess capital allocators. This is no longer simply a legacy business. It is gradually becoming a professionally managed specialty chemical company. Whether that transformation creates value remains one of the biggest unanswered questions. Does the financial story match the business story? After studying the numbers, a clear picture begins to emerge. The company demonstrates several undeniable strengths. Revenue has recovered. Margins remain healthy. Debt is almost non-existent. Cash generation has improved significantly. Free cash flow remains strong. The balance sheet provides flexibility. At the same time, some questions remain unresolved. ROE still trails the best specialty chemical businesses. ROE has moderated. Working capital deserves closer monitoring. And future capital allocation under the new ownership structure remains untested. In other words, the financial statements neither tell the story of a perfect company, nor that of a troubled one. They describe a business with solid foundations entering a potentially transformative phase. So what have we learned? The numbers largely support the business narrative. Indo Borax appears financially disciplined, conservatively financed, and operationally stronger than it was a year ago. But financial statements are backward-looking. They describe what has already happened. Markets, however, care about something entirely different. They care about what happens next. Will recent improvements continue? Can management sustain growth? Will the ownership transition accelerate expansion? Will capacity utilization improve further? Or has the market already priced in all the good news? To answer those questions, we now leave the annual report behind and examine the latest quarter, management commentary, and the company's roadmap for the future. Because in investing, yesterday explains the business. Tomorrow determines the share price. The inflection point. Are we seeing the beginning of a new Indo Borax? Every company has moments that define its future. Some moments are visible immediately. Others are only recognized years later when investors look back and realize that was the turning point. Imagine you're watching a marathon. For the first 30 kilometers, every runner looks almost identical. They maintain a steady pace. They conserve energy. Nobody appears dramatically ahead. Then something changes. One runner gradually accelerates. Not because he suddenly became stronger, but because he had been conserving energy all along. The acceleration isn't random. It is the visible result of preparation that began much earlier. Businesses often behave in exactly the same way. Years of investments, factory upgrades, process improvements, management changes, capacity balancing, customer acquisitions. None of these immediately appear in quarterly profits. Then one day, the financial numbers suddenly improve. Most investors call it a good quarter. Institutional investors ask a different question. Is this quarter merely better? Or is it the beginning of a completely different business trajectory? That is the question Indo Borax's FY26 results invite us to explore. Looking beyond quarterly numbers. Every 3 months, companies announce revenue, profits, margins, and earnings per share. Financial news channels immediately declare winners and losers. A company beats estimates. Another misses expectations. Stock prices react within minutes. But here's the problem. Businesses don't transform every 90 days. Factories aren't built in one quarter. Customer relationships don't suddenly appear. Competitive advantages aren't created overnight. Quarterly results are like photographs. Useful, but incomplete. A documentary reveals much more than a single photograph. So instead of asking, how much did revenue increase? Let's ask, what changed inside the business that allowed revenue to increase? A quarter that signals operational improvement. The March 2026 quarter was strong. Revenue increased by approximately 26% year-on-year. Profit grew even faster. Margins remained healthy despite higher production. On paper, those are impressive numbers. But management's explanation matters even more. The company attributes the improvement to 3 factors. Better capacity utilization, operational efficiencies, improved realizations. These 3 words reveal far more than the headline numbers. Better capacity utilization. Think about an airline. Buying an aircraft is expensive. Whether the aircraft flies with 50 passengers or 200 passengers, many costs remain the same. Fuel changes. Some operating costs change. But the airplane itself has already been purchased. Factories behave similarly. Once Indo Borax built its manufacturing plant, much of the investment became fixed. Every additional ton produced spreads those fixed costs across more output. This improves profitability without requiring another factory. Management indicates that higher plant utilization contributed significantly to FY26 performance. This is encouraging because operational improvement is usually more sustainable than temporary price increases. Operational efficiency. Now imagine 2 identical kitchens. Both receive the same ingredients. Both employ equally skilled chefs. Yet one kitchen wastes almost nothing. The other throws away a significant portion of its food. Which restaurant becomes more profitable? The answer has nothing to do with sales. It has everything to do with execution. Chemical manufacturing works the same way. Reducing wastage, optimizing production cycles, improving energy efficiency, increasing yields. These improvements rarely appear in headlines, but they gradually improve profitability. When management repeatedly speaks about operational excellence rather than simply selling more products, institutional investors pay attention. Because efficient businesses usually remain competitive even when markets become difficult. Improved realizations. The third driver is perhaps the most interesting. Management refers to better realizations. In simple language, this means the company earned more value from the products it sold. Imagine 2 farmers. Both harvest the same quantity of mangoes. One sells them in the local market. The other sells premium quality mangoes to luxury retailers. Same quantity, different realization. Higher realizations often indicate either stronger pricing power, better product mix, or improved market conditions. All 3 are preferable to growth driven purely by volume. Demand remains healthy. One encouraging observation from management commentary is the continued confidence in domestic demand. The company specifically highlights stable demand across Indian markets. Why is this important? Because many specialty chemical companies depend heavily on exports. Exports create opportunities, but they also introduce volatility, currency fluctuations, global recessions, trade restrictions, geopolitical tensions. Domestic demand often provides greater stability. India's continuing infrastructure expansion, industrial growth, and manufacturing investments create a favorable backdrop for boron-based products. Management believes these structural trends remain intact. The bigger story is not revenue. The most important development in FY26 may not actually be financial. It may be organizational. Remember the ownership transition we discussed earlier? For over 4 decades, Indo Borax operated under its founding promoter group. Then, in January 2026, control shifted to a new consortium led by Zenrock Chemicals, together with India Special Assets Fund 3 and Special Situation India Fund. Will employees stay? Will customers remain loyal? These are legitimate questions. The encouraging aspect is that the first few months following the transition have not shown operational disruption. Instead, management appears focused on continuity while simultaneously preparing for expansion. That doesn't guarantee success, but it reduces one major concern: a new leadership team. Companies don't transform because shareholders change. They transform because leadership changes the way capital, people, and opportunities are managed. The appointment of Suresh Kalra as Managing Director and CEO is therefore more significant than it may initially appear. His background spans nearly 3 decades across global chemical companies, including operational leadership, business expansion, manufacturing, and international markets. Institutional investors often prefer professional managers who have solved similar problems before. Experience doesn't guarantee execution, but it reduces the probability of avoidable mistakes. The market will ultimately judge this leadership not by resumes, but by results. What is management planning next? One sentence in the investor presentation deserves particular attention. The company intends to pursue geographic expansion, operational optimization, innovation-led growth, downstream integration. These are not random initiatives. Each addresses a different stage of value creation. Geographic expansion. Imagine opening a successful restaurant in one city. Eventually, growth slows because you've already served most local customers. The next phase comes from entering new cities. Similarly, expanding geographically allows Indo Borax to diversify its customer base and increase market reach. Downstream integration. This may become one of the most important long-term drivers. Let's use a simple example. Suppose you own a dairy farm. Selling raw milk earns one level of profit. Turning that milk into cheese, butter, yogurt, or ice cream creates much greater value. That's downstream integration. The same principle applies in chemicals. Instead of selling only intermediate products, companies gradually manufacture more specialized formulations with higher margins. Management has indicated that it is evaluating downstream opportunities to capture greater value from the same raw materials. Debottlenecking. This is another term that sounds technical but is actually simple. Imagine a 4-lane highway where traffic slows because one toll booth remains too small. Building an entirely new highway may be unnecessary. Expanding the toll booth solves the problem. Factories experience similar bottlenecks. Sometimes small investments significantly increase production without constructing an entirely new plant. Management has mentioned evaluating debottlenecking opportunities to support future growth. This is usually a capital-efficient way to expand capacity. Industry outlook. Management remains optimistic about the broader industry. Their confidence is based on several structural themes: continued industrialization, infrastructure spending, Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, growing domestic demand, expanding applications for boron-based products. Notice something important. Management isn't promising explosive short-term growth. Instead, it is linking the company's future to long-term industrial trends. That is generally a healthier narrative than depending on temporary market conditions. Has the investment thesis changed? This is perhaps the most important question. Imagine reading Indo Borax's annual report 2 years ago. The investment thesis might have been a stable niche chemical company with conservative management. Today, the thesis appears different. It has evolved into something more dynamic. Now investors see a leadership transition, new institutional ownership, professional management, operational improvements, better utilization of existing assets, plans for expansion, stronger financial performance. The company has moved from being viewed as a mature specialty chemical manufacturer to one that may be entering a fresh growth phase. That doesn't mean success is guaranteed, but the narrative has undeniably changed. And in markets, changing narratives often influence valuations long before all the financial benefits become visible. What could derail this story? Every positive development creates higher expectations, and expectations can become dangerous. The market will now expect continued revenue growth, further operational improvement, successful execution under new management, expansion into higher value products, efficient capital allocation. If execution slows, or margins weaken, or demand disappoints, investors may react more sharply than before. Ironically, improving businesses often face higher pressure because the market raises its standards. Success creates new expectations. What have we learned? The latest results suggest that Indo Borax is not simply enjoying a temporary improvement. The combination of stronger operations, better plant utilization, improving profitability, experienced professional leadership, and strategic expansion plans indicates that the company may be entering a new phase of its evolution. But one question still remains unanswered. Even if everything management says comes true, how much of that optimism is already reflected in the stock price? Because a wonderful business does not automatically become a wonderful investment. The price you pay matters just as much as the quality you receive. A luxury hotel can be an excellent business, but if you pay 10 times its actual value, your investment may still disappoint. That brings us to one of the most misunderstood topics in investing: valuation. How do professional investors decide whether expectations have become too optimistic? How do different valuation methods tell different stories about the same company? And why can't two investors look at the same stock and reach completely opposite conclusions? That is the journey we'll begin in the next chapter. One of Warren Buffett's most famous observations is that a wonderful company can become a terrible investment if purchased at the wrong price. The business creates value. The price determines your return. Imagine you're walking through an art auction. A painting goes under the hammer. The auctioneer asks for 10 lakh rupees. Someone immediately offers 20 lakh rupees. Another bidder jumps to 50 lakh rupees. Within minutes, the painting sells for 2 crore rupees. Now ask yourself a simple question. Did the painting become better during those 10 minutes? Of course not. Only the price changed. The value of the artwork remained the same. The stock market behaves in exactly the same way. Every day, investors don't merely buy businesses. They buy expectations. And expectations are often far more volatile than businesses themselves. This is where valuation becomes both fascinating and dangerous. Because valuation is not about finding the correct price. It is about understanding what assumptions today's price already reflects. Price and value are not the same thing. Benjamin Graham, the father of value investing, once wrote, "Price is what you pay. Value is what you get." It sounds obvious. Yet markets repeatedly forget this distinction. Imagine buying a house. If the house is worth 1 crore rupees, but you purchase it for 70 lakh rupees, you probably made a good deal. If you pay 2 crore rupees for exactly the same house, The quality of the house hasn't changed. Only your future return has. Businesses work exactly the same way. Indo Borax may become a significantly stronger company over the next decade. But if investors have already priced in all that future optimism, future returns may still disappoint. Professional investing, therefore, begins with a simple question. How much optimism is already embedded in today's stock price? Market capitalization. What is the market really saying? The market currently values Indo Borax at roughly 1,500 crore rupees. At first glance, that sounds like an ordinary number. But market capitalization isn't just a number. It represents the collective opinion of thousands of investors. Imagine buying an apartment building. You aren't paying for today's rental income alone. You're also paying for future rent increases, future renovations, future neighborhood development, future demand. Similarly, today's market capitalization reflects expectations about Indo Borax's future, not merely its present. The market isn't valuing today's factory. It is valuing tomorrow's possibilities. Price to earnings, pay the market's confidence meter. The first valuation ratio most investors encounter is the price to earnings ratio, or PE. Unfortunately, many people misuse it. Imagine buying a small grocery shop earning 10 lakh rupees annually. If someone asks 1 crore rupees for it, you're effectively paying 10 years of current earnings. If another identical shop costs 2 crore rupees, you're paying 20 years of earnings. That's essentially what the PE ratio measures. It answers one simple question. How many years of current earnings are investors willing to pay for today? Indo Borax currently trades around 35 times earnings. Its broader industry trades closer to 22 times. At first glance, this suggests the company is expensive. But here's where many investors make a mistake. A higher PE doesn't automatically mean overvalued. A lower PE doesn't automatically mean undervalued. Imagine comparing to students. One consistently scores 98%. The other scores 60%. Would you pay more for tutoring from the first? Probably. Similarly, markets often assign premium valuations to businesses expected to grow faster, earn higher returns, or poses stronger competitive advantages. The important question isn't, is the pay high? The real question is, does the business deserve that premium? Does Indo Borax deserve its premium? Let's examine both sides. On one hand, the company operates in a niche specialty chemical segment. It has almost no debt. It generates healthy cash flow. It commands significant domestic market share. It possesses unique pharmaceutical approvals. It recently completed a major ownership transition. Operational performance has improved. All of these factors justify some premium. On the other hand, revenue growth over the last 5 years has been modest. ROE remains around 12%. ROAS has declined from historical highs. Working capital efficiency requires monitoring. The new management team is still proving itself. These factors argue for caution. This explains why valuation becomes an art rather than a formula. Price to book, PB useful, but only partly. Another popular ratio is price to book. Think of it this way. Imagine liquidating an old factory. You sell the land, the buildings, the machinery, cash in the bank. After paying liabilities, whatever remains belongs to shareholders. That is broadly what book value represents. Indo Borax trades at approximately 4 times book value. For asset-heavy manufacturing businesses, PB can be informative. But for specialty chemical companies, it tells only part of the story. Why? Because some of the most valuable assets don't appear on the balance sheet. Customer relationships, manufacturing expertise, regulatory approvals, brand reputation, technical know-how. None of these receive proper accounting value. Yet they may be worth more than the factory itself. This is why relying only on price to book would underestimate businesses with strong intangible advantages. PEG ratio. Is growth justifying the valuation? Now imagine two companies. Both trade at 30 times earnings. The first gross profits at 5%. The second gross profits at 25%. Clearly, they shouldn't receive identical valuations. The second company deserves a higher multiple because future earnings expand much faster. The PEG ratio attempts to combine valuation with growth. It asks, how much are investors paying for each unit of expected growth? For Indo Borax, historical growth has not always justified a very high multiple. Recent improvement is encouraging, but one strong year doesn't automatically establish a long-term trend. Markets often pay for future growth before it actually arrives. That is both the opportunity and the risk. Discounted cash flow, the most powerful and most dangerous model. Among professional investors, one valuation framework dominates. Discounted cash flow, commonly called DCF. The idea is beautifully simple. Suppose someone offers you 1000 rupee today, or 1000 rupees 10 years from now. Which would you choose? Obviously today. Money available today has greater value because it can be invested immediately. DCF applies this logic to businesses. It estimates all future cash flows, then calculates what those future cash flows are worth today. Sounds scientific. But here's the problem. DCF is only as accurate as its assumptions. If you assume Indo Borax grows at 8% annually, one valuation emerges. Assume 15% growth. The valuation changes dramatically. Assume margins improve. The value rises again. Tiny changes in assumptions create enormous changes in intrinsic value. That's why experienced investors never rely solely on DCF. It creates a range, not certainty. Replacement value. Could someone rebuild Indo Borax today? Another interesting question is rarely discussed. Suppose you wanted to recreate Indo Borax from scratch. How much would it cost? Buying land, building factories, obtaining approvals, hiring engineers, developing manufacturing processes, winning customers, building distribution, obtaining FDA certifications, developing decades of trust. Clearly, replacing Indo Borax would cost far more than constructing another factory. Time itself has value. Replacement value reminds investors that businesses consist of much more than physical assets. Enterprise value, looking beyond equity. Imagine purchasing an apartment. One seller asks 1 crore rupees. Another asks 80 lakh rupees. The second appears cheaper. But then you discover it also carries 40 lakh rupees of unpaid debt. Suddenly, the cheaper apartment isn't actually cheaper. Enterprise value adjusts for this reality. It considers both equity and debt. For Indo Borax, this becomes particularly interesting. Because the company has almost no financial debt, its enterprise value remains relatively close to its naturally appreciate this. But remember something. That reflects one of the company's strongest financial qualities. Future growth isn't being financed through excessive borrowing, dividend yield, income, or opportunity. Indo Borax currently offers an attractive dividend, particularly after announcing a special dividend. Income-oriented investors naturally appreciate this. But remember something. Every rupee distributed cannot simultaneously be invested back into the business. Imagine owning a fruit tree. You can eat every fruit immediately, or plant some seeds for future orchards. Neither decision is automatically right. The correct choice depends on future opportunities. The new management's capital allocation decisions over the coming years will therefore become increasingly important. Margin of safety, the forgotten principle. Perhaps the most important valuation concept has nothing to do with formulas. It is called the margin of safety. Imagine driving across a bridge. Would you prefer a bridge capable of supporting exactly 10 tons? Or one designed to support 50? The stronger bridge gives you room for unexpected events. Investing works the same way. Buying businesses below intrinsic value provides protection against mistakes, unexpected slowdowns, or economic shocks. At current prices, Indo Borax appears to be trading with considerable optimism already reflected in the valuation. That doesn't mean the market is wrong. It simply means future execution now matters even more. Behavioral finance. Why expensive stocks often become even more expensive. Markets rarely move in straight lines. When businesses improve, investors become optimistic. As optimism increases, valuation multiples expand. Rising prices attract new investors. New investors push prices even higher. This creates a feedback loop. George Soros described this process as reflexivity. Success creates optimism. Optimism creates higher prices. Higher prices strengthen the narrative. The cycle continues until expectations become unrealistic. Then reality catches up. Sometimes through slower earnings growth. Sometimes through disappointing guidance. Sometimes simply because expectations became impossible to satisfy. The lesson is subtle. Strong businesses deserve premium valuations. Extraordinary valuations require extraordinary execution. So, is Indo Borax expensive? There is no single correct answer. A deep value investor may conclude the stock already discounts much of the expected improvement. A growth investor may argue the ownership transition, operational improvements, and downstream opportunities justify paying a premium today. Both can be intellectually honest. Because valuation is ultimately an opinion about the future, not the past. What we can say with confidence is this. The market is no longer treating Indo Borax like a sleepy small-cap chemical company. It is beginning to value it as a business capable of delivering a stronger next chapter. Whether that optimism proves justified depends entirely on execution over the next several years. What have we learned? Valuation is not about deciding whether a stock is cheap or expensive. It is about understanding what expectations today's price already contains. Indo Borax's premium valuation reflects improving operations, strong balance sheet quality, niche leadership, and optimism surrounding new management. But premium valuations create a different kind of risk. Not business risk. Expectation risk. When expectations rise, disappointment becomes more expensive, which naturally brings us to the most important chapter of every investment story. Every business has strengths. Every business has weaknesses. The real question isn't whether risks exist. The real question is whether investors truly understand them. Because history repeatedly reminds us that markets rarely punish companies for having risks. They punish them when those risks are ignored. In the next chapter, we'll step away from optimism and examine the complete risk landscape surrounding Indo Borax, from raw material dependence and management execution to behavioral biases that can influence investor decisions. What could go wrong even if the story sounds right? Every bull market creates believers. Every bear market reminds us why risk management exists. Imagine you're buying a beautiful beachfront house. The view is breathtaking. The location is perfect. The architecture is stunning. You can already picture your family spending weekends watching the sunset. Then the architect quietly says, "There's just one thing you should know. The house is built in a cyclone-prone area." Suddenly, your perspective changes. The house hasn't become less beautiful, but you've gained a deeper understanding of reality. Great investing works exactly the same way. The purpose of studying risk isn't to reject every opportunity. It is to understand what must go right and what could go wrong. Because markets don't punish companies simply for having risks. Every business has risks. Markets punish investors who pretend those risks don't exist. After studying Indo Borax's business, industry, moat, financials, and recent transformation, this is perhaps the most important chapter of all. Because this is where optimism meets reality. The biggest risk isn't the factory. Most people assume chemical companies fail because of factories, explosions, environmental accidents, equipment breakdowns. Those risks certainly exist. But surprisingly, most long-term investment failures occur somewhere else. They happen inside the boardroom. inside capital allocation decisions, inside management execution, inside investor expectations. The factory simply reflects those decisions. Let's begin with the single biggest risk facing Indo Borax today. Can the new management actually deliver? The ownership transition completed in January 2026 changed far more than the shareholding pattern. It changed the entire future of the business. For over 40 years, Indo Borax operated under its founding promoters. Today, it has entered a completely new chapter. Professional management, institutional investors, new strategic ambitions, expansion plans, operational optimization, innovation, downstream integration. On paper, this sounds exciting, but history teaches an uncomfortable lesson. Changing ownership is easy. Improving businesses is hard. Imagine buying a famous restaurant. The building remains the same. The kitchen remains the same. The chefs remain the same. Yet customer experience can still change dramatically depending on the new owner. The same applies here. The market isn't evaluating only today's profits. It is evaluating whether the new leadership can create a stronger company than the founders built. That remains unproven. This is execution risk, perhaps the most important risk of all. The promoter pledge. One issue immediately catches the attention of institutional investors. The current promoter holding has been reported as 100% pledged. Now, context matters. The pledge appears connected to the ownership transition and financing structure. That makes it very different from a promoter pledging shares because of personal financial distress. But markets rarely like uncertainty. Imagine lending money to someone. If their house is already mortgaged, you naturally ask more questions. Similarly, investors will continue watching this issue carefully until the pledge is released or fully explained through future disclosures. The risk isn't necessarily the pledge itself. The risk is uncertainty. Markets dislike uncertainty more than bad news. Because bad news can be measured. Uncertainty cannot. Dependence on imported raw materials. Remember our discussion about global boron reserves. India doesn't possess abundant domestic boron resources. Most raw materials are imported. This creates a structural dependency. Imagine running India's largest chocolate factory. But all cocoa beans come from another continent. Your factory may be world-class. Your employees may be exceptional. Yet, if shipping routes become disrupted, or exchange rates move sharply, your costs immediately rise. Indo Borax faces similar realities. Its profitability partly depends on events completely outside its control. Currency, global freight, geopolitics, international trade. These aren't company-specific risks. They're structural industry risks. Good management can reduce their impact. It cannot eliminate them. Commodity price volatility. Although Indo Borax operates within specialty chemicals, it cannot completely escape commodity cycles. Raw material prices fluctuate. Energy prices fluctuate. Logistics costs fluctuate. Industrial demand fluctuates. Imagine running a bakery. The quality of your cakes may remain outstanding. But if flour prices suddenly double, your profitability changes. You can raise prices, improve efficiency, absorb part of the increase. But none of those options are painless. Chemical companies continuously manage this balancing act. The best operators survive. The weaker ones struggle. Customer concentration. Fortunately, Indo Borax serves multiple industries: steel, glass, ceramics, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, construction. This diversification reduces dependence on any single customer. However, the company still relies heavily on the broader industrial economy. Suppose India's infrastructure cycle slows. Construction activity weakens. Steel demand declines. Several customer segments could soften simultaneously. Diversification helps, but it cannot eliminate macroeconomic risk. Growth expectations. This may become the most underestimated risk. Not business growth, Investor expectations. Imagine a student who consistently scores 60%. One year, he scores 75%. Everyone celebrates. The following year, he scores 74%. Objectively, that's still an excellent result. Yet, disappointment follows. Why? Because expectations changed. The same happens in stock markets. Indo Borax has recently delivered better revenue growth, better profitability, professional management, improved operational efficiency, institutional ownership. The market has noticed. Now investors expect even more. Ironically, success increases pressure. A company doesn't need to perform poorly for its stock to fall. It only needs to perform slightly below expectations. This is expectation risk. Capital allocation. Cash generation creates opportunity. But opportunity creates decisions. Should management expand capacity, acquire another company, enter exports, develop downstream products, return cash through dividends, reduce working capital? Each decision influences shareholder returns. History is filled with businesses that generated enormous cash flows, only to destroy shareholder wealth through poor acquisitions. Capital allocation determines whether free cash flow becomes future growth or future regret. The new leadership hasn't yet built a long public track record. Investors will watch every major investment decision carefully. Competition never sleeps. A strong moat doesn't mean permanent protection. Competitors improve. Technology evolves. Customers change. Imagine owning the best taxi company in 2010. Then smartphones arrived. Then ride-sharing platforms appeared. Suddenly, decades of competitive advantage disappeared. This is called creative destruction. No industry remains unchanged forever. While boron chemistry remains specialized, competitors can still improve manufacturing, increase capacity, enter high-value products, develop alternative formulations, strengthen customer relationships. Moats require continuous maintenance. Standing still is often the fastest way to lose them. Regulatory risk. Chemical manufacturing operates under increasingly strict environmental regulations. And rightly so. Society expects cleaner production, safer operations, better waste management, lower emissions. Compliance requires continuous investment. Imagine owning an apartment. Every few years, the building requires repairs. Ignoring maintenance eventually becomes much more expensive. Factories behave similarly. Environmental compliance isn't optional. It becomes part of operating costs. Companies that prepare early usually benefit. Those that delay often face unpleasant surprises. Technology risk. Today, boron remains important across multiple industries. But technology evolves continuously. Researchers constantly search for alternative materials, improved formulations, cheaper manufacturing methods, new composites. The probability of complete substitution appears low today. But thoughtful investors never assume technology stands still. History punishes certainty. Behavioral risks. Now let's discuss the risks that don't appear in annual reports. The risks inside investors themselves. Fear of missing out. When a stock doubles, new investors suddenly become interested. Not because they studied the business, because they saw the price. Behavioral finance calls this FOMO. People confuse past returns with future certainty. The danger? Buying excellent businesses only after everyone else has already discovered them. Confirmation bias. Once investors become optimistic, they unconsciously search for information supporting their existing beliefs. Positive news receives attention. Suppose future quarterly results show slowing margins. Some investors may immediately dismiss the data. Temporary. Nothing to worry about. Maybe they're right. Maybe not. Confirmation bias prevents objective thinking. Anchoring. Imagine someone bought Indo Borax at 220 rupees. Another bought at 470 rupees. Both now view the company differently. The first investor thinks, this stock has already doubled. The second thinks, I'm waiting for 600 rupees. Neither opinion necessarily reflects business value. Both reflect psychological anchoring. Investors often anchor to purchase prices rather than intrinsic value. Markets don't care what price we paid. Loss aversion. Behavioral economists have repeatedly shown that people dislike losses much more than they enjoy equivalent gains. This creates strange behavior. Investors hold declining stocks, hoping to recover. Meanwhile, they sell winning investments too early. Long-term wealth creation often requires doing the opposite. Narrative investing. Perhaps the most fascinating behavioral risk surrounds stories. Markets love stories. Artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, renewable energy, specialty chemicals. Once a compelling narrative emerges, investors sometimes stop asking difficult questions. The story becomes more important than the evidence. Indo Borax now possesses an attractive narrative. Professional management, industrial policy tailwinds, market leadership, operational improvement, specialty chemicals, ownership transition. All are true, but stories become dangerous when investors stop checking whether reality still matches the narrative. Opportunity cost. Suppose Indo Borax performs reasonably well over the next 5 years. But another company compounds earnings much faster. Choosing one investment automatically means not choosing another. This is called opportunity cost. Investing isn't simply asking, will this company grow? It asks, will this company create better returns than the alternatives available today? Professional investors constantly compare opportunities, not just companies. Why do investors still buy the stock? After everything we've discussed, you might wonder, why would anyone invest? Because investing has never been about eliminating risk. It has always been about understanding whether potential rewards adequately compensate for those risks. Many investors believe the ownership transition could unlock new growth. Professional management could improve execution. Operational efficiency could continue improving. Downstream integration may strengthen margins. India's manufacturing expansion could increase long-term demand. Those possibilities create optimism. Whether optimism becomes reality remains the central question. What have we learned? Indo Borax does not face one overwhelming existential threat. Instead, it faces several manageable but important risks. Execution, capital allocation, raw material dependence, environmental regulation, competition, investor expectations, behavioral biases. Some risks belong to the company. Others belong to investors themselves. Understanding the difference may be one of the greatest advantages an investor can develop. But one final mystery remains. If businesses change slowly, why do stock prices move so dramatically? Why can a company remain fundamentally unchanged while its share price doubles or falls by half? Why do institutions quietly accumulate shares long before headlines appear? And why do markets sometimes become euphoric or deeply pessimistic, even when the business itself changes very little? To answer those questions, we must move beyond financial statements and enter the fascinating world of market psychology. Because the final chapter is not about Indo Borax alone. It is about how markets think, how narratives shape prices, and how patient investors learn to separate temporary emotions from long-term business reality. The market, the mind, and the future, the final investment thesis. The stock market is often described as a place where money changes hands. But that description is incomplete. The stock market is actually a place where expectations change hands. Imagine standing outside a cricket stadium. Inside, 50,000 people are watching the same match. Every spectator has access to exactly the same scoreboard, the same players, the same pitch, the same weather. Yet ask each person who will win, and you'll receive thousands of different answers. Some are optimistic. Some are pessimistic. Some are emotional. Some are analytical. The market works exactly like that stadium. Every investor sees the same company, the same financial statements, the same quarterly results, the same management commentary. Yet one investor believes the stock is expensive. Another believes it has just begun its journey. The difference isn't the information. The difference is expectations. And once you understand that, you begin to understand why stock prices move the way they do. The market doesn't price today. One of the biggest mistakes beginners make is assuming that stock prices move because of current earnings. They don't. If that were true, every company announcing higher profits would immediately become a good investment. History proves otherwise. Markets price the future, not the present. Imagine booking a hotel for New Year's Eve. You aren't paying today's price. You're paying for the expectation of future demand. Stocks behave similarly. When Indo Borax announced stronger quarterly numbers, the market wasn't rewarding the revenue that had already been earned. That money belonged to history. Instead, investors were asking a different question. If management achieved this today, what might they achieve over the next 5 years? Notice how subtle that shift is. Markets don't buy results. They buy possibilities. Institutions think differently. Retail investors often imagine that institutional investors wake up one morning, discover a company, and immediately purchase millions of shares. Reality is far more patient. Imagine trying to buy an apartment building. You don't inspect it for 5 minutes. You study the neighborhood, the legal documents, future infrastructure, rental demand, maintenance costs. Only then do you decide. Institutional investing works the same way. Large investors don't simply buy a quarterly result. They study whether the company's future is becoming structurally different. That is why ownership transitions often attract institutional attention. The story isn't about one quarter. It is about whether a business has entered a new chapter. Indo Borax appears to be standing exactly at such a crossroads. Not because one quarter was strong, but because several developments occurred simultaneously. Professional management, operational improvements, a debt-free balance sheet, expansion plans, new strategic ownership. Those ingredients together create a different narrative than existed just years ago. Why trends develop? People often believe that markets move randomly. In reality, many long-term trends begin surprisingly quietly. Imagine a small cafe. On the first day, 10 customers arrive. The next week, 20. Then 50. Then 100. People notice the crowd. Curiosity grows. More people visit simply because others are already visiting. Business improves. This creates what behavioral economists call a feedback loop. Success attracts attention. Attention attracts customers. Customers improve success. Markets behave similarly. Improving earnings attract investors. New investors push prices higher. Higher prices attract analysts. Analysts attract institutions. Institutions increase visibility. Visibility attracts more investors. This cycle can continue for years, until expectations eventually become too optimistic. Reflexivity, when price changes behavior. George Soros introduced a fascinating idea called reflexivity. The concept sounds complicated. The reality is simple. Sometimes rising prices actually change business outcomes. Imagine a company whose stock price doubles. Suddenly, raising capital becomes easier. Employees feel wealthier. Customers notice the company. Banks become more willing to lend. Acquisition opportunities increase. The higher stock price itself begins improving the business. The opposite also happens. Falling prices reduce confidence. Expansion slows. Talent leaves. Banks become cautious. The business weakens further. Prices and business influence each other. Not always, but often enough to matter. Indo Borax now enters a phase where positive execution could strengthen investor confidence, and stronger investor confidence could create additional strategic flexibility. That possibility exists, but it must still be earned. Fear and greed never disappear. Benjamin Graham once imagined the market as a business partner named Mr. Market. Every morning Mr. Market offers to buy your business or sell his share to you. Some days he becomes wildly optimistic, other days deeply depressed. His mood constantly changes. Your job isn't to agree with him. Your job is to decide whether his offer makes sense. Think about Indo Borax today. Some investors now see India's manufacturing story, specialty chemicals, professional management, market leadership, operational improvement, strong technical momentum. Others focus on premium valuation, execution risk, imported raw materials, working capital, ownership transition. Both are looking at exactly the same business. Their psychology creates different conclusions. The technical story without looking at charts. Earlier, we briefly discussed the company's long-term market behavior. Notice something interesting. Price strength appeared after operational improvement became visible. This is common. Markets often detect improving businesses before headlines become popular. Increasing participation, improving liquidity, greater institutional interest, higher conviction among long-term investors. These behavioral signals often accompany improving business quality. But they should never replace business analysis. Think of market behavior as a thermometer. It measures temperature. It doesn't explain why the patient has a fever. The business remains the real diagnosis, putting every piece together. Let's step back. For the last several chapters, we've examined Indo Borax from every possible angle. We started not with the company, but with India. We saw how government initiatives like Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, infrastructure expansion, and domestic manufacturing have created a favorable backdrop for specialty chemical companies. Then we explored Indo Borax itself, a company founded in 1980, patiently focused on boron chemistry, quietly building customer trust over 4 decades. We examined an industry few investors discuss, an industry supplying agriculture, steel, glass, pharmaceuticals, construction, and advanced manufacturing simultaneously. We explored competition, not through headlines, but through customer behavior, switching costs, pricing power, trust. Then we walked around the company's economic moat, regulatory approvals, specialization, operational expertise, manufacturing know-how, relationships built shipment by shipment. The financial statements largely supported the business story. Healthy margins, minimal debt, strong cash generation, improving operations, but also reminded us that raw capital efficiency and working capital still have room for improvement. Recent results suggested the beginning of a possible transformation rather than the end of one. New management, institutional ownership, expansion ambitions, operational improvements. Yet valuation reminded us of an uncomfortable truth. The market has already noticed. This is no longer an undiscovered business. Finally, risk reminded us that no investment is ever free from uncertainty. Execution, competition, commodity prices, management decisions, behavioral biases. Every opportunity carries a price. So, what is the investment thesis? Notice something important. Throughout this documentary, we never ask whether Indo Borax is a buy. That question is actually too simplistic. A better question is this: under what conditions does the investment thesis become stronger? The thesis strengthens if the new management successfully executes its strategy, operational efficiencies continue improving, capacity utilization rises further, downstream products increase margins, the company converts stronger cash generation into disciplined capital allocation, institutional ownership gradually expands, ROE and ROEs begin improving toward industry-leading levels, governance remains transparent, and the promoter pledge issue is resolved in a way that builds confidence. Now ask the opposite question. When does the thesis weaken? It weakens if growth slows materially after the recent recovery, Expansion destroys rather than creates value. Capital allocation becomes aggressive without adequate returns. Commodity inflation permanently compresses margins. The ownership transition creates strategic instability, or the market's expectations rise much faster than the business itself. Notice something. Most of these conditions have nothing to do with next week's share price. They concern the next several years. That is how institutions think. 3 questions every investor should ask. Before investing in any business, not just Indo Borax, pause and ask 3 simple questions. First, if the stock market closed for the next 5 years, would I still be happy owning this business? That question forces you to think like a business owner rather than a trader. Second, what assumptions must come true for today's valuation to make sense? Every stock price contains expectations. Understanding those expectations is more important than memorizing valuation ratios. Third, what evidence would convince me that I am wrong? This may be the hardest question of all. Great investors aren't those who are always right. They are those who recognize changing evidence before everyone else does. Intellectual flexibility is one of the rarest competitive advantages in investing. Returning to where we began. At the beginning of this documentary, we didn't start with Indo Borax. We started with India, with a country attempting one of the largest manufacturing transformations in its history, with policies encouraging domestic production, with infrastructure expansion, with industrial self-reliance, with the invisible materials quietly supporting that transformation. Now, after understanding the company, the industry, the competition, the moat, the financials, the opportunities, the valuation, and the risks, we return to exactly the same place. The future of Indo Borax will not be decided by quarterly earnings alone. It will be shaped by a much larger story. India's industrial journey. If India succeeds in becoming a stronger manufacturing economy, companies supplying the invisible building blocks of that transformation may benefit. But only those capable of executing consistently, allocating capital wisely, and adapting to change will create lasting value. History rewards execution, not narratives. Final reflection. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Indo Borax is not its size, nor its market capitalization, nor even its recent transformation. It is the fact that a company manufacturing a product most people have never heard of has quietly become part of India's much larger industrial story. That is often where long-term investing becomes most interesting. Not in businesses everyone already understands, but in businesses quietly solving problems that the world increasingly needs solved. Whether Indo Borax ultimately becomes one of India's next great specialty chemical success stories is a question only time can answer. The market will continue changing its opinion every day, but the business will continue writing its story, one factory shift, one customer relationship, one capital allocation decision, and 1 year at a time. And perhaps that is the most valuable lesson of all. Great investing isn't about predicting the future with certainty. It is about understanding the business deeply enough that, whatever the future brings, your decisions are guided by evidence rather than emotion. So the next time you hear about a company you've never noticed before, don't ask only one question. How much has the stock gone up? Ask a better one. What invisible forces are quietly shaping this business? And are they strong enough to endure long after today's headlines are forgotten? Because in investing, as in history, the most important stories are often the ones unfolding quietly, long before the rest of the world notices.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.